I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blimke.
And you're listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. You can now listen to all of our episodes and see show notes at FriendlyAtheistPodcast.com.
By the way, we now have a merchandise shop on the website. So if you want your podcast swag, and you know you do, go to our website and click on the store tab.
Dr. Leigh Eric Schmidt is the Edward C. Mallinckrodt Distinguished University Professor in the Humanities at Washington University in St. Louis. He joined the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics in 2011. He previously taught at Harvard and Princeton. He has appeared in and on all kinds of media to talk about his work, and he's the author of several books. His latest, the reason we wanted to talk to him, is called Village Atheists: How America's Unbelievers Made Their Way in a Godly Nation. So, Leigh, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you.
So let me just ask the most basic question here. One of the rumors we keep hearing online from a lot of religious right leaders is that we live in a Christian nation. So what do you have to say about that idea?
Well, my point to that would be that it's been endlessly debated, that the assumption somehow that it's a Christian nation has had its critics from the get-go. And so rather than take that as some sort of given that this is clearly a Christian nation in some kind of way, certainly there's a Christian majority, but the notion that it's somehow officially a Christian nation is an idea that's been debated from the first generation after the revolution right through to the present. And so what's important is to get inside that debate and to see that there have been secularist dissenters from that concept of a Christian America from the beginning. So they can see that it's not something that one can just get away with pronouncing, but rather that you have to enter into the discussions of that and see how the debate has been shaped over time.
I think one of the most compelling arguments I've heard against the fact that it's a Christian nation is that the framers of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, didn't really mince words. And if they wanted it to be an explicitly Christian nation, I think they would have been more clear about it.
They would have said so in the Constitution.
Yeah,
Declaration.
exactly.
Right. So that's, yeah. And in fact, those within evangelical Protestant communities who want to advance the Christian nation perspective have long seen this as actually kind of a defect in the founding documents, so much so that there have been organized efforts from the 1860s into the 1890s, for example, of really just making sure that stated explicitly, in the founding documents, to amend the Constitution in some way to make it clear that it's a Christian nation. So there is an acknowledgement on the part of Christian apologists that the documents didn't get this right. It wasn't explicit enough. It wasn't clear. So there's that. And then there's also this sense on their part then that, well, if we don't have it in the documents, it's kind of just so much a part of the social fabric. Christianity is so much a part of the social fabric that it's kind of operating, it's functioning as a Christian nation just because Christians have such a large presence in American social life. So they kind of back it up in that kind of way to that kind of argument. But there is an acknowledgement often of your point, Jessica, that it's just not there on paper. In some sense, there is this problem with this godless constitution that has to be confronted by Christians who are trying to construct a Christian nation argument.
We hear a lot of pushback against atheists in society that, we need God more in society now than ever before. Was that always the case in our nation's history, or was it more secular, for the first 100 years of its existence?
Yeah, that's a great question, a big question, and one I've puzzled over for a long time. And what's the trajectory here? Was the nation more secular somehow? Its founding, the church is less powerful. in that first 30 or 40 years than they would become after a series of evangelical awakenings and revivals. Certainly, the Christian church has added a lot of members over the course of the 19th century, in some ways kept up that march of growth right through the 1950s. So you could see it as, well, there was a more secular period in which a figure like Thomas Jefferson could get elected. He was controversial for his religious opinions, but at least he could get elected, right? Mm-hmm. And that over time, the predominance of Christians made it harder for atheists, infidels, and freethinkers to really have a public voice. So I think that it's conceivable that there is something like that going on. On the other hand, in that founding period too, in that first 30, 40, 50 years of the Republic, blasphemy laws were much more powerful. Infidels found it harder really to speak their mind in public. There were ways in which it seemed obvious that one shouldn't speak out, that you should sort of keep your irreligious opinions to yourself. So, on the other side, there's a ways in which I think it's not so much that there was a secular founding and then this process of the nation becoming ever more Christian as the churches grew and grew in membership. From the other side, it looks like there has been ways in which a secularist vantage point has gained momentum with time, and that it really took off with these Supreme Court cases in the middle decades of the 20th century, where there was finally a principle of neutrality that believers cannot be favored over non-believers in American civil life. So that kind of looks like, well, the story should be told, that the secularist principles are actually gaining momentum over time, and so we should tell the story that way. So what I end up with, actually, is just like we have to tell both stories simultaneously. We have to kind of move back and forth between them, a kind of this, and see this kind of ongoing tension between Christian understandings of the Republic and the secularist understandings, and it is very hard to say the story's marching in one direction or another. It's rather the kind of back and forth, the engagement between these camps that really has to be attended to.
How do you think being a Christian at the founding of the nation was different than being a Christian today?
Well, let's see. That's a good question too. So I think in the at the end of the 18th century, there were there was a large number of Protestants who still thought that churches should be established, that the government should officially favor Christianity in one way or another. And so now there were Christians, Baptists, many Baptists, for example, who were favorable toward the kind of Jeffersonian sense of separation. But there were many Christians that still had this sense, no, the government should support the churches either with taxes or they should just kind of create some kind of establishment here. So I think in the early 21st century now, there aren't many American Christians who would come out and think that way. I mean, there aren't. They may feel like they're embattled in some kind of way. They may think that they should have more cultural authority. But there aren't that many making a case for Christianity being the established religion of the nation. I think that the principle of separation and the principle of religious freedom, that those principles, however debated and contested, have nonetheless pretty much crowded out that earlier way of thinking of Christianity as the state religion.
I'm wondering if that sort of, I feel like now we have almost a test of Christianity. At debates, people are asked about, how does your faith inform your opinion? Barack Obama is constantly being questioned on, is he really a Christian? Would they have had these sort of tests of some sort earlier in the country, or is this a relatively new thing we're seeing?
Yeah.
Right. There were definitely those who wanted to impose a religious test, a kind of de facto religious test. So, for example, when Jefferson was running for president in the election of 1800, there were many, many Federalist clergy who thought that, Jefferson just didn't pass that test. I mean, you just couldn't have a free-thinking deist like him elected. So they had a kind of sense that while it wasn't an official test, it was a test that the voters would enforce, right? And, in many ways, there's still that kind of test, right? I mean, that it's hard. It's not as strong as it once was. It's certainly not as strong as it was during the Cold War, in which the last person anyone could imagine electing would be an atheist, right? I mean,
yeah, we're no longer at the bottom of the list. I think socialist is now at the very bottom of the list.
Thanks, Bernie.
And we're
Muslim,
second to last.
Socialist. I mean, atheists have some company now, but atheists, of course, remain at or near the bottom in most of those polls. But it isn't. It has gotten somewhat better. I mean, the latest polling is that just above 40%, I think, of Americans would see atheism as disqualifying someone from holding public office.
And
still got a majority.
Yeah, more than 50%, I think, for the first time, said they wouldn't care. They would vote for an atheist if they supported.
So this increase in the number of Americans who have no religious affiliation, who have no clear religious identity, which is up to about almost a quarter of the population, and is very strong, obviously, in the millennial cohort. That's changing that. I think that sense that there is a religious test being employed for public office is eroding ever so slowly, but it is eroding.
Your book focuses on four freethinkers, whatever the label they used, but four freethinkers kind of who did very different things to kind of challenge the status quo. And I'm wondering if you could share like one short story of one of them and what we can learn. Because when I looked at the names of the people you were focusing, as someone who, writes about atheism for a long time, they are not familiar names to me. And I'm wondering what we can learn from some of those people you wrote about.
Yeah, I intentionally tried to get off the beaten path a little bit in looking for figures. I mean, Robert Ingersoll, most everyone in the free thought community would know and would see as a hero and as kind of an embodiment of a kind of golden age of American free thought. So I kind of wanted to get off that path and onto some others. And one of my favorite stories is this cartoonist, Watson Heston. And he's not the most agreeable person in the world, but he becomes the kind of artist hero of secularists and atheists and free thinkers in the late 19th century. He publishes at least 1,200 cartoons, mostly in this journal called The Truth Seeker, but all of them filled with this kind of anti-religious animus, his criticism of Catholics and Protestants, and his critique of church-state entanglements, his anti-clericalism, and all of that. And I found his images very compelling. And I also thought his story was fascinating as this kind of hard scrapple figure in southwest Missouri, Carthage, Missouri, and how he makes a name for himself in the secularist world as an artist. Never makes any money much off of it, but becomes quite renowned as this artist of secularism. And so I was able to reconstruct his story, but also then reconstruct the kind of vision of secularism that his artwork entailed. And so, and I thought one of the lessons that come out of that story when you really attend closely to visual satire and cartooning, of course, is this is one of the flashpoints that we all encounter in the early 21st century is whether atheists and free thinkers should employ satire as a major weapon against religious people, and what are the implications of that? I mean, it's a life and death question. Obviously, with the things like Charlie Hebdo and so on. And so it seemed to me, in looking at Heston and looking at his artwork carefully, I could get a kind of a background story around all of the attention we're paying to this question of whether there's a kind of right to ridicule, or whether religious ridicule has to be policed in some way because it's so incendiary. What's the balance between the feelings of religious people and this right to free expression? And so I thought the struggles over Heston's art, the struggle, and also just the compelling qualities of being able to rebuild that story about him, but then also just getting inside the artwork and all of the controversies it generated at the time, I thought would give us a window onto the ways in which those issues are playing out in our own world.
So he got a lot of pushback in his time, and we kind of see, like you're saying with Charlie Hebdo, but we see the same thing when, South Park makes fun of religion, when comedians really tackle a particular faith too. So it seems like a lot of those themes are still carrying strong today.
Right, yeah, and there are, South Park episodes about these cartoon wars in the 21st century, and it does seem it plays directly into these kind of cartoon wars that Heston was involved in, where he's getting a lot of pushback, obviously, in the Christian community, where people who think that his art should be suppressed, that his main venue of publication should be shut down, the True Seeker, that it was just too blasphemous, too profane, too sacrilegious, and it should be shut down. The publication, his artwork is banned in Canada. It's embargoed as a danger to public order and moral decency. One of his picture books was burned in the streets in Los Angeles. He gets a lot of pushback. There's some pushback, though, also among atheists and freethinkers who say, this isn't really the best way to advance our cause. We're offending Christians too much. We should find a more civil way of engaging religious people. This kind of artwork is not making us any friends. It's not converting anybody to our cause. So let's not do that. Let's find a more civil way to engage.
That is very much a debate we still have today.
Yep.
Right. So I feel like it's the heart of a lot of the debates we still see about in the atheist community. So Heston seemed like a good way of thinking about that. And the nice thing about it too is we in the 21st century context, we're often thinking about it in terms of atheism versus Islam, especially the depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. And in this context, it's really about Christian responses to visual satire, and it's a helpful reminder in our context of the incredible offense Christians have also taken to this kind of visual satire. And that it's not, the debate is not simply a debate between the West and Islam somehow. It's a debate also between enlightened satire and Christianity.
So, going back to our founding fathers, you said Thomas Jefferson, it's pretty well known that he was a deist. Many of the founding fathers didn't necessarily believe in the Christian God as we see it now. Over history, is there anybody that we'd be surprised who is an atheist who maybe wasn't necessarily forthcoming about it?
Yeah, that's always the suspicion, right? That there are a lot more figures who are non-believers than are willing to admit it, right? Because all the pressures to not be candid about it, to kind of keep your cards close to your chest, and not be open about your unbelief because there are too many social penalties associated with being openly atheistic or openly secularist. So if it is about hiding what's unbelief, I mean, a lot of the times that remains well hidden. And so, it is in that first half century or so, it's only a pretty small handful of infidels and unbelievers who are kind of willing to be out there. There is that kind of sense that there's this pressure, the expectation to keep quiet about it, that there's too much respectability or reputation at stake to be transparent about one's unbelief. So what you get is certain notorious figures, like all of the questions that are aimed at Jefferson, or a figure in the 1820s and 1830s, this infidel editor in Boston, Abner Nealon, who's tried for blasphemy and convicted of blasphemy. I mean, he's openly, very open about his unbelief. But it tends to be those kind of figures, a few risk-taking journal editors, but there's a few deist clubs and things like that. But it's there aren't too many. I mean, what I found, for example, in this question of whether, could an atheist be elected, could a freethinker be elected, was that ban kind of in place? Were there more than every once in a while you would come across a story, right, where this atheist in Iowa is elected at a city council level in 1856. Everyone knows he's an atheist, but he has so much respect locally, for his moral integrity and for his place in the community, that they overlook that and they go ahead and elect him. So there are some cases, but it isn't. I don't think that there are some famous folks out there who were atheists and that I've somehow found them out. I don't have those kinds of stories. Not
Sure.
People we know, like, so guess what? So and so turns out to be an atheist. I mean, there's always debate, a lively debate. That's what you find out is people want to claim famous people for their community. So Abraham Lincoln, for example, lots of ink is spilled on both sides, claiming, well, no, Lincoln was really a Methodist. No, Lincoln's really a free thinker and a non-believer. Or Frederick Douglass, the same thing with Frederick Douglass. There are free thinkers who think Frederick Douglass is a free thinker, a non-believer.
It's interesting you bring up the presidential race, too, because one of the things we saw in this year's campaign is that Bernie Sanders got to the level he got to, and every time people asked him about his faith, yes, he's Jewish is the label he uses, but every time he talks about it, it's a very secular form of it, and it seemed like that was the least interesting thing about Bernie Sanders, and that may have helped him in a sense. His atheism, or whatever, his secular Judaism, what have you, it didn't seem to hurt him. No one was attacking him, DNC emails notwithstanding. No one seemed to be attacking him for that.
I wonder if that was partially because he also took on the label socialist, which tends to be
worse.
Tends to be worse.
Yeah. Which turns out to be worse, right?
So he was just I'll roll with this.
So I mean, Bernie Sanders is an interesting case where it didn't seem to hold him back, and it is. People did take that as a sign. See, look, the religious test is eroding. This kind of sense that you have to put on a kind of religious air, affect a religious air. That's just a necessary part of being in public life. That Bernie Sanders didn't do that, and Bernie Sanders was still very popular. So in the hacked email, the DNC email, where they're speculating, well, maybe Bernie Sanders is not merely that he has a Jewish heritage, but maybe he's actually an atheist. If he's an atheist, then that really could count him votes.
Right.
But it's not like it would go anywhere, and it's not like anybody was going to use it against him. So that was a pretty good sign of the weakened power of that charge.
Yeah, the only thing that worried me about that is I wonder if Bernie was a singular figure who that wouldn't have hurt because of all the other things he's said, how he identified himself.
Right.
If you level that against Hillary Clinton, that could go much further, but that's not the case.
Right. In fact, I mean, Trump did sort of insinuate at some point.
Right.
I mean,
we don't know her faith.
Well, we don't know anything about Hillary Clinton's religion.
Yeah.
She's been in public life. She might, and the insinuation was she might be a non-believer.
Right.
I mean, just like Barack Obama might be a Muslim. I mean, that's the kind of his insinuation. Now, of course, it had no legs to it, the insinuation, because it's obvious to everyone.
Wait. Trump said something that had no legs to
story. But he insinuated it in front of evangelicals,
right.
this evangelical group in New York. So that was there. But it just doesn't have much credibility when it comes to Hillary Clinton. I think you all did an interview with Barney Frank a couple of years ago, which I thought was
wasn't us, but I do know the Openly Secular campaign did do an interview with Barney Frank and asked him about his. He came out as I'm openly secular, but also maintained his Judaism. And later on, he said, I don't use the word atheist.
Right. So he said that no politician should pick that fight, basically. I mean, why use the atheist word? I don't want to pick that fight.
He said it would come across as anti-Semitic to the people because he identified as Jewish. He didn't want to portray himself as trying to run away from that label.
I think that's an interesting point. And of course, I mean, Bernie Sanders has that too then. I mean, which is, in that interesting way in which secular Judaism affects the way we think about these labels too. And we don't have quite the same counterpart among Christians, that same way in which you can move between secular and religious identities. It's harder to do.
Let me ask you, if you were to ask me today, who are the most famous atheists in the country, I would probably point you to certain authors, scientists, or comedians. But if we go back 100 years or 200 years, what sorts of people are the big freethinkers of their day?
Right. Well, I think that you would look at someone like Robert Ingersoll, who's this great orator who is genuinely popular, with audiences broadly. It's clear that many Christians enjoyed listening to him. I mean, he had lectures not just on, debunking Christianity, also had lectures on Shakespeare and things like that. But he had an incredibly good sense of humor. He was incredibly eloquent, and people just wanted to hear him. I mean, he was a phenomenon in that kind of way. So I think that the famous atheists and free thinkers of his day, they were often people on the lecture circuit. That was the medium. It was people who could get up there on the platform and really entertain people. And Ingersoll was the best at it, but he had a lot of company, including one of these people I talked about, Samuel Putnam, who was really good on the lecture circuit. And they probably had 30, 40 of these lecturers in that era who were good at it, good at really holding a crowd's attention, good at really getting the free thought message out. So I think that was the chosen medium. That was the most powerful, far-ranging medium, was this lecture circuit. So it was the most famous ones were usually the lecturers. Though, I would say somebody like Watson Heston as a cartoonist had an incredible effect. I mean, he's sort of a comic, a comedian, but just a great visual satirist. He had real impact in that medium. And then there were scientists that were important. Oftentimes they weren't closely aligned with organized free thought. They were rather kind of authorities just beyond organized free thought, like Andrew Dixon White at Cornell, or someone like that who really had a keen sense that religion and science were at war with one another. And so those kinds of intellectuals in the scientific community who pushed that kind of warfare argument between religion and science, they also had a lot of influence. But oftentimes they weren't, out there in the organized movement or an organized secularist movement. That wasn't true, but they were invoked. They were regularly invoked.
So when you hear about all these freethinkers who were out there, they were public about it, what comes to mind then when you hear people refer to, today's atheists, some of them, as quote unquote the new atheists.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a historian, when you hear someone say, "Oh, these are the new atheists," you go, "Well, the new atheists sound quite a bit like the old atheists, and maybe they're not so new." Or you read all these accounts about the new atheism of the 1960s, when French existentialism was becoming popular, or a kind of organized humanism was becoming popular, or the Death of God movement was so popular at the cover of Time magazine, and so on. And that was the new atheism of the 1960s. So I guess you sort of bemused. If you're a historian, you're often bemused by the announcements about the newness of things like that. But there are some differences when it comes, to the new atheism. I think a lot of the new atheists, at least compared to the Cold War, they didn't have to sit around spending a lot of time saying, "I'm not a godless communist." They had the luxury of taking off after the Cold War was really winding down and dissipating. So they didn't have to sit there and say, "No, I'm not a godless communist," in the way that any atheist in the post-World War II period through the 1980s, that just would have been one of the first things they would have had to explain, is the difference between being an atheist and a communist or something like that. So that's different. And I think there's just a better demographic base for atheist expression in the 21st century than there has been before. This quarter of the American population that's willing to say they don't have a religious identity, they don't have a religious affiliation, that just gives the new atheists a base, a kind of readership, and it just makes them a little more mainstream. They're communicating to a much bigger group of Americans who might well share their reservations about organized religion, or at least are indifferent about those claims. And so that changes it. If in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, I think you could say 8 to 10% of Americans were probably in this kind of free-thinking, irreligious camp. But if you get up to 25%, that makes a big difference. That's a significant minority at that point. So that, I think, has changed the reach of the new atheists. Is they have a bigger section of the population they could speak to and then help articulate their own discontent about religion.
Well, we wanted to thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Leigh Schmidt, his new book is called Village Atheists, How America's Unbelievers Made Their Way in a Godly Nation. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the podcast for FriendlyAtheist.com. This episode was taped at Cinnamon Sound Studios in Aurora, Illinois, and the music was written and performed by Brad Chagdis. If you like what you're hearing, please consider making a contribution at patreon.com/Hemant, that's He-Man-T. We appreciate your support. I'm Hemant Mehta.
And I'm Jessica Blumke. We hope you'll join us next time.